Good morning from Bangkok, and welcome to a seminar, Law and Lawlessness, Myanmar Coup and Human Rights. This event is convened by the Asia Center and the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. It's part of our series of activities on developments in Myanmar. Today we have a legal roundtable, literally, and with expert commentary from speakers of different nationalities from around the world. And they will be with us shortly. They are currently online. I'll kick off the event by providing everyone a quick update on developments in Myanmar. And following which, I will invite each of the speakers to give us a general comment and take from their perspective on how they see developments in Myanmar. Firstly, it's been 39 days since the coup. We are here today to make sense of those difficult developments affecting the people of Myanmar. Over 60 protesters have been killed. We have seen the use of military-grade weapons for policing and crowd control. Often we have seen scenes directed by senior officers instructing junior officers to shoot at crowds. Several thousands have been arrested, especially on night raids, although some have been released. We hear of sanctions. We hear primarily the US-led targeted sanctions. We hear about the most recent UN Security Council presidential statement to reverse the coup. We also have heard a lot of diplomatic rhetoric, mostly around the Asian region, ASEAN, China, India, Japan. But on the grounds, there are calls to do more, to move away from rhetoric to sanctions, even though there is a counter argument that such sanctions might hurt the people. Yet others are silent. We see the civil disobedience movement on the ground, where there's increasing articulation that perhaps nobody can help the people, that the revolution is in the hands of the Myanmar people. Again, there's also a formation of the NLD authority, where observers have asked for a more inclusive kind of local or government in opposition to the military junta. We have seen the ethnic armies also coming together. We have seen breakaways, such as the UN RAP and several embassies. We have seen the police, several police members flee to India. We have seen, for the first time, especially in Southeast Asia, large-scale internet shutdowns. Most recently, yesterday, media shutdowns, and even the employment of lobbyists on behalf of the junta to put a different spin on the situation happening in Myanmar. We hear that in some jurisdictions, Myanmar workers and students abroad can raise their hand and voices against what's happening in the country. In other jurisdictions, the governments there forbid and caution Myanmar residents in their countries to protest or not to do anything illegal. With this context, I would like to, first of all, invite our panel, our speakers. I'll start with Kin Mai Ong. Kin Mai has over 20 years of legal experience. She is born in Yangon and has been living and has grown up in the US. She's part of the larger Burmese diaspora network globally and in the US. Kin Mai, what are your thoughts over these developments?
Sure. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's great to be able to debrief these events with this amazing group of experts. So I guess just to give you a little background on myself, as James mentioned, I am Burmese American. I'm a civil rights lawyer, and most of my work, my own work, focuses on civil rights in the United States for immigrant rights and racial justice. And I first became involved in looking at civil rights in Myanmar after the Rohingya crisis of 2017, when I found that there was a lack of Burmese Buddhists kind of speaking out at the time in opposition to what was happening to the Rohingya and the general kind of rise of Buddhist nationalism and increasing pressures and concerns for the civil rights of religious and ethnic minorities. And over time, my work has expanded from looking just at the Rohingya to also looking at civil rights of other religious and ethnic minorities. I think a certain solidarity movement has formed between different ethnic and religious minorities who want more autonomy or who simply want equal civil rights in the country. And also among Buddhist Burmese progressives in the country and in the diaspora. But that said, immediately prior to the coup, I think that there was very little hope of a more general kind of coming together of a Burmese national identity that was more inclusive of religious and ethnic minorities, and increasingly the cutbacks on civil rights of all Burmese within the country. And even though there was a strong progressive movement forming, I think the idea of shifting the entire national consciousness was, I didn't think there was much hope of that happening in the near future. Now, after the coup and what's happened in the country with the the civil disobedience movement and kind of the increase in political activity in favor of democracy, in favor of the reinstitution of the National League for Democracy's overwhelming victory. For the first time, even though this is a very frightening time, it's a very dangerous time to be in Myanmar right now. And scores of people have been arrested, people have been killed, across the country. But I see this as a moment of hope for whenever we get through this dark period, that finally we may be able to form a broad kind of coalition of people from Myanmar and in the diaspora, for that matter, people like me, who embrace a more inclusive national identity that fully includes different ethnic and religious minorities. I think the question is how we get from where we are, which is a very dangerous and frightening time, to that place. But the reason I say that this is a moment of hope is that I think that there's kind of a new politicization of many people in the country that were not politicized in recent years. And in a way, it reminds me of the military era when I was a child in Myanmar, then called Burma, and during which I left, when even though the country at the time was lurching toward a more of a populist nationalism that was focused on the Burma ethnic majority national identity and increasingly on Buddhism, from the more inclusive federal vision of the country at the time of independence, which Aung San Suu Kyi's own father, had originally proposed. Like this increased intolerance was kind of not really, there was not so much focus on it in the mainstream Burmese society, because I think there was this universal distrust and hatred of the military, which even if people couldn't talk about it always publicly, if you were living in the country, it existed. And so I think that it was easy for a lot of people within Burma and in the diaspora to unite against the military. And so I think that when there was a transition to semi-democracy in 2015, I think that it these differences between different interest groups and growing intolerance for religious and ethnic minorities was not something that was much talked about, or at least outside of progressive communities, and certainly not, but something that I thought a lot about as someone who happened to be Burmese American, but at the time was much more focused on issues in the United States. And I think that in the 5 or so years that there was this semi-democracy with Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy in power, leading a civilian government, and the military also power sharing and controlling a lot of industries and important ministries. Some of these divisions and intolerance within the country began to come out. Part of it was that the military, even more increasingly, as has been widely reported, began to kind of egg on and kind of allow Buddhist nationalists, kind of extremist monks who are very intolerant of Muslims in particular, and non-Buddhists to some extent. As I won't go much into the details, because a lot of this has been reported, but there were, as many of you know, fake news accounts that were created on Facebook and social media, spreading fake news about Muslims and Rohingya. And I think that a lot of the fissures within the country have come out. But I think that now, with the growing of the civil disobedience movement, a lot of ways it feels a lot like the old days when there was a common enemy of the military to fight against. And so in that, I think that there is an opportunity whenever we get to the other side. And at this point, we're about a month and a half in, and in February 1st, I wasn't I kind of it wasn't entirely a surprise, but I wasn't sure exactly how it was going to go down, and whether it was somehow going to be resolved sooner rather than later, or it was going to drag on. And I think at this point, it will take some pressure internationally and domestically to turn things around. And we can talk later about what are the conditions that can lead to that. But whenever we get to the other side, and hopefully, it can happen without like a massive number of casualties. Quite a number of people have already died, and quite a number of people are currently detained. So we have to be concerned about those people and additional people who may be detained or killed. But whenever we get to the other side of that, I think that there is an opportunity for the people that are rightly the leaders of Myanmar. That currently it's the National League for Democracy, or another political party that may come about eventually out of maybe the civil disobedience movement, out of the youth movement that's very, very strong right now, in protests in the streets, and many of the pictures that we've seen that could forge ahead with a new national identity that is truly inclusive of the incredible religious and ethnic diversity of the country, and moving toward a vision of civil rights for everybody that doesn't involve a lot of the loopholes in the law that exists right now, where there's a number of vague provisions in the penal code that allow that criminalize speech insulting religion, which is often used to clamp down on anti-Buddhist speech, even though the law itself doesn't specifically identify any particular religion. There's the ability to ban statements that just vaguely disturb public tranquility. And then, the telecommunication laws allows the targeting of criticism by political opponents. So all of these things that make the country not only an intolerant place, but also a place where the civil rights and liberties are not freely protected, there's an opportunity to move beyond all of that. And I think that in the time that it's been in power, the NLD, you know, I think they've in their own way tried their best, but they've made a number of mistakes. And I think personally, most notably, by failing to put forth a broad, inclusive vision of unity for the country. And I often think that, you know, many of the things that happen in my country of adoption are similar, where, you know, we have one political party that's increasingly lurched to the right. And I think one of the reasons that, you know, the people on the other side have not been able to kind of, until very recently, counter that has been like difficulty with kind of forging a broad, inclusive counter vision. And, you know, in Myanmar, I think that, you know, whether it's not too late for the NLD, if they should be able to get back in power, to finally do that. Whether it can be Aung San Suu Kyi and her close confidants, many of whom are really on the older side at this point, I don't know. I think there's still possibility that I don't know, but that there are some young, up and coming politicians. Like there's a gentleman who's the provisional elected government's envoy to the UN, Dr. Sasa, who is Chin, which is an ethnic minority, who seems to, you know, be promising. And I think that there some young and up and coming parties from the NLD could, you know, play that role, or a new political movement or coalition of different ethnic minority parties that are quite strong in several regions, to come together in a broad, inclusive vision. And so I choose, even though it is a very harrowing time for those of us with roots in the country and with connections to the country, I choose to see this time as a time of hope, when we can finally kind of wipe away the old and build a new vision, one that's modeled on the same inclusive vision that we had at independence, and really redefine Burmese nationalism, Myanmar nationalism, into one that's modern and inclusive and respectful of civil rights for everyone. And I look forward to the conversation to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Kinmai, for that overview and the whole idea of inclusiveness as we move forward. During this webinar, we will be running two polls. We are launching the first one to get your thoughts about this idea about rhetoric and sanctions. So please let us have your views. And while the poll is in progress, I would now like to introduce our next speaker. That's Professor Andrew Harding. He is a constitutional law expert from the National University of Singapore. And we like to sort of bring Professor Harding here into the conversation to give us an insight and an overview about the legal and political dimensions of what's happening in Myanmar. Over to you, Professor Harding.
Right. Thank you very much, James, for the invitation. It's great to see everybody here, and thanks for the opportunity to address to this audience very important issues about the coup in Myanmar. As James said, what I want to talk about is really the constitutional aspect and the issue of legitimacy which arises with this coup d'etat. And then after that, I'd like to go on to address the issue of maybe what might happen in the future, which has been raised by Kinmai just now, and I agree with the point that she made, that it's also a moment of hope, not just disaster. But coming back to the coup itself, this has been presented by the Tatmadaw as an exercise of emergency powers under the 2008 Constitution. And I think it's very important to reject that claim very roundly because it really has there's no good argument to support their position. In the first place, there was no factual emergency in Myanmar on the 1st of February that would give rise to any such claim that a proclamation of emergency was required. In fact, the instability that we now see in Myanmar is entirely attributable to the events on the 1st of February. So it's attributable to the Tatmadaor's own action, not to any pre-existing situation. Now, of course, the Tatmadaor has presented its disagreement with the Union Election Commission as the reason for the proclamation of this emergency. But that disagreement is, first of all, a very flimsy position taken by the Tatmadaor. And even if what they are saying is true, it still would not justify the proclamation of an emergency. The position with regard to the election that was held in November is that while I think many commentators and many Myanmar people would admit that there are difficulties with the electoral roll that was used for that election, nonetheless, the NLD did win the election overwhelmingly. And the legal position is that the decision by the Union Election Commission is final. And that may be a source of a problem here, because having confronted the UEC over the election, it was clearly difficult for the military to back down without resorting to some further measures. The only measure legally that you can take, I suppose, is to go to the Constitutional Tribunal. But since the decision of the Election Commission is final, it's difficult to see how the tribunal, even were it sitting, it isn't sitting, would be able to resolve the matter satisfactorily. And I think that may have been a problem in the drafting process for the 2008 Constitution. So very clearly there was an overwhelming NLD win. Apart from that, the entire process of proclaiming the emergency was unconstitutional. In the first place, an emergency can only be proclaimed by the president. The president was summarily arrested when he refused to proclaim an emergency and has been turned out of office unconstitutionally, along with one of the vice presidents and the state councillor Aung San Suu Kyi, who have been arrested. The military have no power to arrest these officials or detain them. In addition to that, in order to proclaim an emergency, there needs to be a meeting of the National Defense and Security Committee, which was not called on this occasion. So the vice president, substituted for the president, had no power to proclaim the emergency, and therefore no power to transfer executive, legislative, and judicial powers to the military. So the effect of an emergency is extremely drastic by international standards under Myanmar's 2008 constitution. But in any case, this whole process was very clearly unconstitutional. And I think there should be no debate about this. It is as clear as people disputing Trump's claim that the Democrats stole the presidential election in the US. There is no debate about this matter. It is purely put forward as an excuse. The real reason, of course, for the coup is that because of the rigidity of the 2008 Constitution, where the Tatmadaor is able to prevent any constitutional reform whatsoever, the election result meant that there was kind of unstoppable momentum for constitutional change. And let's bear in mind that although the Tatmadaor have managed somehow to trash the 2008 Constitution, it was drafted by them in order to protect their rights and privileges and prevent any kind of accountability for their actions, including human rights abuses, corruption, and so on. That is why it was drafted in the way that it was drafted, so that the military power would be entrenched and there would be no further constitutional change. This is why people refer to it as a Praetorian Constitution, because it's under the protection of the military. But even this constitution was not enough for the Tatmadaw. They were not satisfied with having 90% of the power. They wanted 100% of the power. The fact that there was this momentum for constitutional change, and the NLD had increased that momentum by winning the November election with an overwhelming majority, forced the Tatmadaw, I think, into a corner, resulting in this drastic action by them. Now, why is this important? I think it's extremely important because the issue of legitimacy is paramount, and because the Tatmadaw have set out their position as being a legitimate exercise of power, which it is very clearly not, even on the most liberal interpretation of this very strange constitution. Therefore, I think it's very important that we and that the international community roundly condemn and do not recognize this as anything other than a military coup. And I'm dismayed to find the Security Council referring to the situation as an emergency. It is not an emergency. It is an unconstitutional coup d'etat by the Tatmadaw. And people in the media are even now referring to the Myanmar military as the government and as to the authorities. They are not the government, and they are not exercising any lawful authority. I think we need to be extremely clear about this point, and to resist any attempt to secure legitimacy on the part of the Tatmadaw. Obviously, what they intend to do is to present a kind of de facto situation that people would eventually adjust themselves to, and that eventually the protest would subside, so that irrespective of the arguments that I put forward, they would enjoy some kind of de facto legitimacy. That, I think, has to be very strongly resisted, and we should be standing shoulder to shoulder with the people on the streets of Myanmar who are risking their lives and limbs going out on the streets to protest in what some people have referred to not as a protest, but as a revolution. Let me now just move on to where we go from here. Now, as I've said, this constitution is a very problematical one. Over the last 10 years, there has built up a very strong feeling that this constitution needs to be reformed, and the form of power sharing that it involves is simply not workable, because the whole system is absolutely gridlocked between the civilian and the military power. And as we've seen with successive attempts to amend the constitution, the Tatmadaw simply exercises the veto that it can exercise using its 25% seats in both houses, which are not elected, they're purely appointed people. So they have a kind of democratically illegitimate power in the first place, which they have not hesitated to use to block every possible change that has been proposed from any direction, particularly by the NLD. So in a way, I think Kin My Aung is right, that it is also an opportunity, because this constitution is one that needed to be got rid of somehow, and maybe by indulging in this unconstitutional action, perhaps the Tatmadaw have unwittingly kind of opened the door for a new constitutional debate, which is exactly, I think, what needs to happen, because heaven forbid, as I think one of the questioners suggested, that a new constitution should be drafted by the military, because it's a military drafted constitution that caused all of these problems in the first place. So that's definitely not the direction in which we want to go. So as things are, we can see that having started with this unlawful action, slowly things are spinning out of control, and this is extremely alarming. You can see every day more and more drastic actions are being taken by the military, and it's very important, I think, that they have abandoned the standard of legality. They are not adhering even to their own laws, let alone to normal principles of fundamental rights. And these powers which they have assumed under the Constitution mean that Parliament can be prevented from meeting, which is why we've got the CRPH operating. It means that fundamental rights can be simply ignored. It means they can draft any law they like, and they can even secure their own judgments on compliance with those laws, because they control the military, they control the judicial power as well. So it's a terribly drastic situation. Finally, I think we need to recognize that the CRPH, the committee representing the Pidongsu Thotor, is the nearest thing that we have to a valid constitutional authority in Myanmar at the moment. Obviously, since Parliament cannot meet, it's not possible to comply with the constitutional provisions because the military has prevented that from happening. So I think it's perfectly legitimate for the CRPH to present itself as representing the legitimate government of Myanmar at this point. But let me finish with the hope that from this drastic situation, that somebody somewhere in the military will see sense, and that some sort of accommodation can be reached, which returns us to a position of legality and constitutionality. And with that, James, I will hand it back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Harding, for the constitutional and legal analysis and showing us the different pathways and the challenges ahead, and how the military has essentially, is ruling by its own laws. With that, I would like to move on to the next commentator. That's Professor So Takahashi. He's a professor of human rights and peace studies at Osaka Women's University. Professor Takahashi, the floor is yours.
Yes, okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for this opportunity. First, I want to say that I'm very happy to see so many people on the panel that have worked so tirelessly on the Rohingya issue, because I will also be touching a little bit on that. I want to talk mainly about, I'm a human rights lawyer. That's what I do. And I cut my teeth in places like Amnesty International, and I worked in the UN, and that's just, that's what I do. But of course, the human rights dimension of what's happening right now is something that's been very well reported on and very well analyzed. So I'm not really going to talk too much about that. Rather, I'd like to talk just a little bit about the Japanese perspective, if you like, and what sort of role Japan has been and could play. Japan's a very important country in the Myanmar equation, needless to say. There's a long history of relations, and we were for quite a long time the major donor of aid to the country until the Chinese overtook us, and it's been like that for a while. So what Japan does about the current situation is pretty important, but unfortunately, but perhaps unsurprisingly, it's been pretty disappointing. And I think it's been a good example of Japan's human rights diplomacy, and I put that in sort of inverted commas, human rights diplomacy in general, because what Japan's position on human rights diplomacy in general has been a case of we try to have our cake and we eat it too. Because on the one hand, we have Japan frequently stressing its solidarity with Western countries. I'm using that term in a very sort of general, sort of common way. So obviously the United States in particular, but also Australia, the UK, Europe. And this, this emphasis has been more and more over the past few years. The idea is that we're firmly a member of the Western alliance, military and political, The government has been emphasizing that. It's been emphasized in popular discourse in the media. You can see from how the term Indo-Pacific to describe our region has just entered into the common parlance, and it's just like common day now. So the idea is that we're firmly a member of the Western Alliance. In terms of the UN regional grouping, it's the Western Europe and Others Group, WEOG or WEOG. So these are the countries that we want to hang around with. These are the countries that we want to be identified with. This is the club that we want to be part of. That's really been the idea. And again, especially in recent years, there's been a very strong emphasis on being part of the alliance in terms not only of politics and the military, but also in terms of the values that we believe in. So, quote unquote, Western values, democracy, the rule of law, even human rights. And of course, through stressing how we're part of that whole club, the idea really is to contrast with how China is, how we want to portray China. They are the bad guys. They're undemocratic. They don't respect human rights. They don't believe in the rule of law. We're one of the good guys. So through stressing the kind of country we are, the idea is to create a juxtaposition with the kind of country that, you know, the elephant in the room is, China. But at the same time, of course, Japan's always been, generally been extremely wary of taking a clear stand on human rights issues, at least taking a clear stand in terms of openly criticizing countries on human rights issues. When things hit the fan, like they have in Myanmar recently, Japan tries to take a back seat and tries to steer clear of taking clear sides. I basically sum it up by saying Japan wants to be seen as one of the good guys, but doesn't want to do the necessary to actually be one of the good guys. That's how I would sort of sum it up. And Myanmar is really a very clear example of this. And you know, certainly the genocide of the Rohingya is one of those clear examples. You know, from the get-go, Japan was very hesitant about taking any kind of strong stance at the Human Rights Council or international fora in general. Throughout, Japan tried to defend Myanmar, claiming there were, you know, sort of admitting that there might have been human rights issues here and there, but trying to emphasize that there were quote unquote security concerns, and, you know, the operation in general was justified. We had the ambassador using government terms like Bengali to describe the Rohingya. So very, very troubling, very indicative of how the whole, you know, that whole attitude was. Very worryingly, Japan gave full support to the Independent Commission of Inquiry, the ICOE. Also, it was also known in some sectors as the Rosario Manalo Commission from its chair, a very prominent diplomat from the Philippines. A lot of people haven't heard about the ICOE, probably because it was such a joke. It was a commission made by the government of Myanmar to basically, with the intention of whitewashing the genocide, and generally to deflect international criticism by pretending that Myanmar was investigating allegations seriously. From the outset, it was very, very clear that the ICOE was not established to, quote unquote, point fingers at anybody, that the issue of sort of personal responsibility or accountability was not part of the remit. And basically, it was, the whole exercise was you know, to deflect criticism and to whitewash the whole thing. So Japan lent legitimacy to this initiative, we provided it with a prominent diplomat to serve on the commission, and there was general political support. If you look at our foreign ministry website, the Japanese foreign ministry webpage, you'll see that there's a press release about the activities of the ICOE. It's a general sort of trying to sort of present it as a legitimate initiative and something that's worthy of commendation. The initiative, of course, at the risk of stating the obvious, was a complete flop. It did little except embarrass Japan and all the other countries involved. But that was very indicative of the whole sort of position that Japan tries to take with regards to human rights issues in Myanmar. So right now we see this kind of thing happening again. You know, Japan is on the one side insisting that it stands up for democracy and democratic values and human rights. And there has, you know, concern has been expressed about what's been going on in a somewhat lukewarm way, but it has been expressed. But at the same time, Japan has proven very hesitant to put its money where its mouth is. It's steered clear of the very strong statements that other countries have issued. The issue of sanctions has been very sort of tippy-toed around. Just a few days ago, a government spokesperson stated in Parliament that they saw the military government as their quote-unquote counterparts. So suggesting that they recognize its legitimacy. This connects with what Andrew was just talking about sort of de facto, the longer that this sort of drags on, the more there's going to be momentum for other governments to just sort of give up. The Japanese government does insist that it has very strong contacts with the military, and that this has been the case for a while, and that it's been using those contacts to try to influence it. So basically, it's the propagation of the notion that we're in a better position than Western governments to actually influence what's going on, and that we're using our leverages in the most effective way possible behind the scenes to influence what the military does. Obviously, we don't see any results with that. And certainly given the position of the government during the Rohingya genocide that I was just talking about, there's a pretty serious credibility problem with all of this thing. The narrative within the country in terms of the media and the like is equally pretty disappointing. Focusing only on the need for stability, once again, quote unquote, so that Japanese businesses can go on their merry little way with making money. Kirin, it's our major beer company. It has, I think, 60% of the share of beer in the country. They've got quite a bit of positive press abroad because Kirin very quickly announced after the coup that it was canceling its plans to fund some kind of joint venture with a military-owned company. This has actually been going on for a long time, since before the coup, so it's not really something new. But that's not to say that it's not a positive step. It is a positive step. It's a good thing. But there are copious amounts of large Japanese companies, household brands, that have not taken that kind of step and are continuing on with their plans. Or I don't think that anything's happening right now, but certainly no plans have really been suspended or canceled to continue on with funding what are essentially military-owned companies. And the government hasn't made any announcement with what it's going to do with official development aid either. So again, it's very much sort of a tippy-toeing around what's happening. The other main pillar of the whole narrative, and I sort of mentioned this at the beginning, and again, it's very much the elephant in the room, is the need to check Chinese influence in Myanmar and in Southeast Asia in general. And this is this is very, very strongly emphasized in the media and the like. So if we take two strong steps, if we join the West in calling for sanctions or demanding action and just generally sort of doing terrible and frightening things like criticizing them openly, we might push the military further into China's camp. This conveniently justifies Japan's lack of action, of course. So we're sort of in a Kafka situation where allegedly we're the champions of human rights vis-a-vis China. Remember that there's all this talk about us being part of the Western alliance and Western values and democracy and human rights, and this is all in an effort to emphasize how we're different from China. But we can't be too strong on human rights when things actually happen, because that would actually strengthen the Chinese hand. So we have to sort of be very, very careful about this kind of thing. So it's a clear, there's a clear sort of contradiction in this. But nobody ever said that we'd be consistent with these kind of things. But the containment of China is certainly a very, very big thing, and in how this whole crisis, the current crisis, is being portrayed in Japan. But like, like our panelists have already said, I mean, what really needs to happen is Japan really needs to put its money where its mouth is in terms of human rights. And, we need to stand shoulder to shoulder with the people in Myanmar protesting on the streets and at great risk of their lives and security, and really advance the cause of human rights in Myanmar through any way possible. So I look forward to the discussion, and I hope we can think of some ways that is possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Takahashi, for that very insightful and detailed view about Japanese policymakers thinking around reactions to Myanmar and how the Japanese generally approach in terms of human rights issues in their foreign policy. Next, we have Catherine Southwick. She's an atrocity prevention advisor, currently attached to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Catherine, the floor is yours. Please share your perspective. We are so happy that you could join us. Over to you, Catherine.
Yeah, thank you very much, James and the Asia Center, for inviting me to join the panel. I've been following the situation in Myanmar for several years. I wrote about it in partly for my doctoral dissertation, and have sort of worked with and supported in different ways organizations, human rights organizations, and Burmese and Rohingya groups involved in advocacy in that on those issues for some time now. But I also need to say that whatever I say is purely in my independent capacity and does not reflect anything in any way from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, where I'm a consultant on a specific project. So, but my remarks are going to focus some more on the role of the international community and how I think it can play a more constructive role in helping to bring about stability, rule of law, and human rights in Myanmar. I don't see this as a matter of like what others have said of sort of restoring the situation from the past and from before the coup, because that period to me was characterized by a situation of severely compromised political space while the military continued serious abuses against ethnic minorities and journalists and others, and helped to perpetuate ethnic divisions that was counterproductive to democratic development and rule of law in the country. And in fact, it's the effective impunity of the military vis-a-vis those atrocity crimes against minorities like the Rohingya that I believe contributed to letting the military think that it can or could get away with this coup and the ensuing repression. My analysis is that the international community should coordinate its response to the coup to help the civil disobedience / democracy movements achieve its objectives to peacefully restrain the power of the military, if not remove it altogether, and to devise a more genuine, inclusive democracy. And I think doing so is consistent with three key interests that many in the international community have supported, which is supporting democracy, preventing mass atrocities, and upholding international law. In this case, these international actions in line with these interests can contribute to the overarching interest in regional stability in the medium to long term. And with respect to promoting democracy, this movement provides an opportunity to strengthen international commitment to democracy in general and specifically in Myanmar. The independent watchdog group Freedom House released its annual report this month and found that the global decline in democracy that it observed in 2006 has accelerated, and that fewer than a fifth of the world's people now live in fully free countries. And to reverse this decline, Freedom House suggests that democratic governments work in solidarity with one another and with democracy advocates and human rights defenders in more repressive settings. And now the civil disobedience movement in Myanmar provides an especially compelling opportunity that I believe would be costly to miss. This movement is a promising example of civil resistance to authoritarianism, as it has some of the crucial features that political scientists cite for successful civil resistance movements. It is nonviolent, It has a very broad and diverse base of support, which cuts across generations, professions, ethnic groups, and has already eroded the military's legitimacy vis-a-vis the population. It has demonstrated thus far that it's resilient in the face of repression. It has recruited, crucially, elements of the state bureaucracy and law enforcement, with civil servants refusing to work, Burmese diplomats denouncing the coup, and hundreds of police joining the CDM, which I read just a couple of days ago, causing military defections, perhaps at low levels among the younger soldiers, would signal even greater promise for this movement. Also, it is decentralized and not concentrated around a single figure. And finally, there are signs that there is a strategic vision for constitutional reform, along with a bureaucracy in place if or when the military leaves the scene. Clearly, this movement is performing the essential role of being a driving force for change in Myanmar and would stand a greater chance of success with coordinated international and regional support. This coordination, international support is most effective, provided that it's carried out with the support and in coordination with the domestic movement. Before the coup, that as Kinmai brought up, this disunity among ethnic groups, which included minimizing and even approving crimes against the Rohingya and other groups, severely constrained the international community's ability to promote democratic development in the country. And it led many international actors to tolerate abuses against ethnic minorities in the hope of preserving limited and compromised space for political autonomy and economic investment. And now it appears that the Myanmar public and the international community can act on the truth that democracy based on substantive rule of law and human rights is unattainable while genocide and egregious abuses against minorities persist. Now, international engagement at this stage is also critical for preventing further abuses and mass atrocities. Right now, Myanmar is in a state of high risk for atrocities. Coups and crackdowns on protest are routinely cited as potential triggers of mass violence. Myanmar, particularly when it is run by the military, also exhibits classic risk factors and warning signs for atrocities, including ongoing armed conflict, nationalist ideology, impunity for past crimes, the removal and replacement of elected or moderate leaders from office, and worrying concerns about stockpiling weapons, among others. What we also know is that when the military is in control, ethnic minorities are more vulnerable. Humanitarian assistance in displaced communities has been severely constrained even more since the coup. And other governments where refugees have sought shelter are getting away with serious abuses and crimes of neglect, such as Bangladesh sending Rohingya refugees to the flood-prone island of Bhasan Char, India deporting 160 or so Rohingya refugees back to Myanmar, and recent reports of ASEAN governments doing little to help Rohingya fleeing the country on boats stranded at sea. Now, with limited or inconsequential action, the prospect of atrocities will only rise, and the options available and capacity for international action to have an impact will shrink. Now, in the face of these risks and ongoing abuses, the international community has obligations to act. Under the UN Charter, Genocide Convention, various human rights treaties, Rome Statute, et cetera, responsibility to protect, as well as their own domestic laws, such as in the US, we have the Elie Wiesel Act, which was passed in 2018. And the international community theoretically has a range of tools, which many have talked about, but these measures should be consistent with the democracy movement's efforts to deny the military legitimacy and weaken its sources of power, money, guns, and personnel. These measures should support the resilience of the civil disobedience movement as well, providing financial or technical assistance as needed. And with respect to the military, there's targeted sanctions, asset freezes, export controls, arms embargoes, diplomatic derecognition, and perhaps some incentives or a vigorous diplomatic effort to persuade military leaders to reverse the coup and step aside through creative off-ramps. Some governments have taken steps, as was noted in the introduction of this seminar, such as the United States, including new sanctions and asset freezes, as well as freezing $1 billion at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York that blocked military rulers from moving. I know that the UK and the EU are considering more sanctions. Corporations have reduced operations. Facebook and YouTube have banned the military from its platforms. And what has not happened is an arms embargo, which the UN human rights investigator on Myanmar urged the Security Council to impose earlier this month, in addition to sanctions on Myanmar oil and gas enterprise, which apparently represents the military's largest source of revenue. Total from France and Chevron have a large offshore gas project in partnership with this corporation. The key question with sanctions, of course, is that they actually do, in a coordinated fashion, cut off the military's sources of revenue with minimal harm to civilians. And the bottom line is that the current situation appears not to be in anyone's interest except the military leadership. It also seems to be of conflicted value for China, which we could talk about at some point later. It frustrates the long-held aspirations of Myanmar's people for a genuine inclusive democracy, where the military is under civilian control and not the other way around. It imposes severe risks of mass atrocities and economic uncertainty. And without the military in control, this democracy movement shows signs that it has the unity, resilience, and a long-term vision to facilitate a stable democratic change, so long as preferably with some international support. And we could elaborate further, but I think in helping democracies abroad, we're also helping ourselves, because what happens with other democracies impacts other democracies. What happened in the US over the last several years has echoes in Myanmar, and what's happening in Myanmar has resonance in the US. The strength of international solidarity and supporting democracy based on equal rights for all can help sustain hope for Myanmar, and as well signal the resilience of democratic principles worldwide. So, thanks.
Thank you, Catherine, for your perspective, especially casting a clear light on the role of value of sanctions. Next, we have Rais. Rais is founder and board chair of the Rohingya Human Rights Network based in Canada. Rais, thank you very much for joining us from afar with all of us globally, broadcasting here out of Bangkok. Rais, the floor is yours.
Thank you, James. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm being a little cognizant of time. We're only shy of 2 minutes before closing. So I will not be very long. I'm going to only shed light from a Rohingya perspective and from the Rohingya Human Rights Network's perspective on this issue, this incredible unfolding that's happening in Myanmar today. So our position, the Rohingya position, I would say, is exclusively unique in nature, not only because we have received the worst end of the persecution in the past, but also because today we don't have any organized representation in the protest that is happening. Neither do we have any legitimate armed group that can bring forward the added value that some of these ethnic armed groups have brought to aid the civilians in the streets. For us, it is still a struggle for recognition, that never happened during the civilian regime, and that has never happened during the military regime neither. In fact, ever since Ne Win came into power, all our rights have just gone down the drain, including when the civilian regime came to power under Aung San Suu Kyi, needless to explain. However, today, for the first time ever, we are seeing some really unusual, hopeful allies. And I was really shocked not too long ago when NLD representatives from Canada and from the US were approaching us, saying we could perhaps work together and so that we could support the CRPH. We have had not very long ago the ethnic armed groups, notably the Arakan Army, that's working to help our cause or in collaboration with our cause, because we have a common enemy today, of course, the Tamadao. To bring ICC witnesses, notably defaulters from the Tamadao. And then we have the civil disobedience movement. We got student unions, business unions, civil society unions, name it. And among them, for us Rohingya, Specifically, we see Rohingya girls in the eyes of young martyrs like Khalsin. We see Rohingya women in all those women who have been the protesters who have been raped by the police. We see Rohingya politicians, for example, in those politicians, the Muslim politicians and non-Muslim politicians alike, who have been detained by the military and then tortured and killed. It could have been very well my extended family, Ushremong, who is now in Texas from USDP party. He could have been one of them if he was still in Yangon, for example. And we see today unprecedented solidarity shown by Buddhist monks, Kachin Christians, and others alike towards Muslims. However, yet, at Rohingya Human Rights Network, we are cautious that all these groups do not have the same demands. CRPH, for example, they aim to bring back the NLD. The CDM has various demands. Some of them, they also want to bring back Aung San Suu Kyi as well. But at Rohingya Human Rights Network, we have an unequivocal mandate to push for an all-inclusive federal democracy with equal rights and accountability for everyone. It's natural for us to be cautious because we have seen, and see who we trust and who we do not, because in the past, our history speaks for itself. When we supported Aung San Suu Kyi, wholeheartedly, only to see her take autocratic control and then help the Tatmadaw, openly on our face, defending them at the ICG. So, but still, we're still, it doesn't take away, we're willing to, put back the past and work for the future together, as long as, now I'm saying this because we do not have that representation in all of these rallies that you see coming forward. As long as you recognize us as citizens of Myanmar, as ethnic people of Myanmar, that we are children of Burmese soil, we are willing to work with you, with whoever is openly and publicly and sincerely recognizing us. Our hats off to those who are on the front lines. Their courage and audacity is unparalleled. Our hearts and souls, our activism voices, as well as our dollars, they go out to you. And we hope and pray that you will work with us, and you will feel what it was like for an unknown number of Rohingya men and women who were slaughtered, who are tossed in mass graves, and who are gang raped. This is the moment to feel like what it was like to be Rohingya under Tatmadaw, and hence work in genuine solidarity that includes the Rohingya as well, to create an all-inclusive society that will eventually establish law and end this lawlessness that's happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rais. Before I get on to invite questions as well as a reaction from Robin Ramcharan, Executive Director of the Asia Center, we spoke a lot about sanction. I want to give you quickly the results of the first poll. Over 63% of you participated in the poll, and 89% said yes, that Asian governments need to do more beyond rhetoric and also include sanctions. 11 of you responded negatively with a no. We now are running the second poll. This is now going out to you, which is, focusing on a larger stakeholder support and solidarity action for what's going on in Myanmar. While you have a go at the poll, can I now invite Robin to offer his reactions for between around 5 minutes. For the speakers, we have received a lot of questions, which all has been redirected to you individually. So if you could also, review the questions that have been sent to each individual speaker, and you will have a final go, each of you from the order in which you started to give your reactions. So before that, Dr. Ramcharan, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, James. I listened with great interest to all of your interventions, all of your points. I cannot do justice to all of them in this quick reaction, but what I was listening for is you know, Kin My Aung said earlier that she used the term the other side, getting to the other side. And I think Catherine was also speaking to this. Catherine Southwick was also speaking to this in terms of, you know, the forthcoming, the atrocities, the signs of atrocities. And as I was listening to you all, and especially the two speakers I mentioned, I get the sense that we are headed for a very long, protracted struggle. And so, you know, how can we, one of the things I was listening for is how can we shorten that, if I may put it, that protraction. And so, oops, excuse me. How can we shorten that protraction? I am not sure how we can, because of the international configuration, the regional configuration, and the local configuration. And this speaks also to what Rais Tinmong was just talking about. Can the different groups, yes, there is a sense of who is the common enemy, but can they unite in a protracted struggle? And of course, we must remember also that all of this is coming on top of an already difficult coronavirus situation with additional restrictions and so on. So as I was listening for the ways out of this long, protracted struggle, the point was mentioned about a new inclusive Myanmar. So I found it interesting that on the one hand, Kin My Aung is saying, if I may paraphrase very crudely, Kin My, back to the future, yeah, back to the future. And Catherine is saying that, well, no, this is not quite possible, and we need something new. But Kin My, maybe you offered a way out in terms of asking, suggesting that new parties may emerge. And I think Rais has spoken to this as well. The problems with the current civilian party, ruling party, civilian government that has run the show quite legitimately since the last two elections. So I wonder if maybe you could address those particular tensions as we go forward. Can we really go back to the future? Who will take us there? Is the solution a new decentralized multicultural federalism? I think perhaps Andrew, Professor Harding may be able to speak to that. Catherine Southwick spoke about challenging the Tatmadaw. You all did. And so how can we, and Professor Harding also talked about this, how can we have a new constitution to overcome the stranglehold of the Tatmadaw? And Catherine, you suggested the international community should come together, target its effort in support of the protest movement in order to defeat an obviously well-resourced military junta. And so how can we do that? I think we can come back to aspects of that in the discussion. And the third point in terms of way out and solutions, and I think what Saul was talking about, what Catherine was talking about, I think they are obviously connected in terms of the support of the international community. But we see a divided international community, unfortunately. The UN Security Council statement was by the president, right? And who is the president? That's the United States. So it's a welcome statement. But I echo Andrew Harding's concern about the use of the term emergency rather than coup. And I think this has been a sticking point in the Council between China, Russia, and others. So no formal full-on statement has come out of the Council. The role of Japan, I think, is, so there are two players here, which Saul rightly mentions, who could potentially have a significant impact, Japan and China. But Saul explained, I think you explained very well, the catch-22 for Japan. So what can the international community do really? Yeah. So far, it seems that the measures have been somewhat symbolic. And my last point here is my fourth point in terms of looking at how we can get over this quickly and what are the solutions are, I think was mentioned in one of the questions or the comments that was made online, which is we have to do it ourselves ultimately, right? We cannot rely on the international or regional community. ASEAN is totally disappointing in this regard. So let me leave my reactions, comments, / questions, if I may put it that way, and we can move to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramcharan. We now go on to the reaction from the commentators we have gathered on this webinar. Once again, thanks to all the attendees who've been sort of just sending us a stream of questions. We have apportioned them. There's quite a few, so we've just apportioned them to the individual commentators for their reactions. So I'll ask each commentator to take no more than 3 minutes to respond, starting in the order in which they spoke. So Kin Mai, the floor is yours.
You're on mute.
You're on mute, Kin Mai.
Sorry. You know, I think the question of how we get to the other side, there was a Good Frontier Myanmar article, which in the interest of full disclosure was written by a friend of mine, Im Tha, who has spoken on an Asia Center panel with me in the past, that kind of laid out kind of what are the elements that would take to get from here to the other side, if you will. And I think one of the things is indeed that it may be a protracted struggle, that there needs to be ways to support and assist protesters in the civil disobedience movement, find ways to restore emergency services from, you know, people from like hospitals, you know, notwithstanding that we support people, civil servants who work at those hospitals who may be staying home from work. One thing that I and other Burmese expats and immigrants abroad have been through informal networks, through kind of grassroots collectives and temples and Burmese associations, have been working on finding ways to send resources. There's one young group that I've been advising called the Baydar Collective, BAYDAR Collective, and I can put their name in the chat. It's very new, so they're still building out their network, but trying to find trusted nonprofits that will work with vetted partners in places like Bangkok to send PPE and SIM cards to protesters in Myanmar. And then I think domestically, there's also infrastructure that's being put in place to try to keep people protected in this effort. And I think international pressure, I mean, I'm not an expert on the intricacies of sanctions and how those work, but I think that certainly the type of targeted sanctions focused on the military and entities associated with the military's freezing of assets along the lines of what Catherine described, I think, are helpful. And I think Saul is also correct about kind of Japan, role in this. And I think Japan could certainly step up and play a more meaningful counterweight to China. I think just more coordinated actions by these different parties, international parties, supporters outside. And frankly, the last part is the different political parties within the country and political movements. I think we see that beginning to happen, but it needs to go to the next step, because I think in any kind of political movement, sometimes there's fracturing as well that kind of naturally happens due to personality or just genuine difficulty in getting on the same page in a challenging time.
Thank you so much, Kin Mai. Next, over to Professor Harding.
Right, thank you, Robin. Let me try and answer the various points in one kind of stream that might put together some of the things that would be necessary to get to this other side that we have been discussing. Now, I think the first point is that any solution to this enormous problem has got to come from the Myanmar people themselves. I think there is a limit to what the international community can do other than sort of encourage from the sidelines. But essentially the job has to be done by the Myanmar people. And unfortunately, as we have seen, even the 2008 constitution took about 17 years in the drafting, and the second Panglong peace process is simply something that has not really been happening over quite a number of years now. So the prognosis is not terribly good. In terms of the short-long question that Robin was talking about, it is obviously going to be a long process, and we're nowhere near even the beginning of that process, let alone the end of it. So how could this happen? Now, one of the questioners suggested, maybe the 2008 constitution could just be abolished. Well, I think in the longer term, it has to be abolished because it is the source of all the problems that we now have. But in the shorter term, the abolition of the constitution would lack any legitimacy. What right would the CRPH have to abolish the constitution on the basis of which they claim the Tatmadaw has acted unconstitutionally? So if they abolish the constitution, they would remove all the kind of legitimacy of their own position, not that of the military. And then the military would be just free to do whatever they like because there's no constitution to comply with. So I agree that any future constitution has got to involve federalism, and that is because of the overarching issue of the ethnic minorities that has been discussed several times already. Now, I would say there are three principles that need to be adhered to, what I call the 3 Ds: democratization, demilitarization, and decentralization. I think all of those three will be necessary in a new constitution, but the decentralization is going to be particularly difficult because at the moment the ethnic minorities are not on board. However, there may be some hope here because, as has been pointed out already, Catherine was making this point, that the protest movement is very broad-based, and we've got a situation where there is potential to recruit all minorities behind this opposition to the military. And that could be really the only thing that stands a chance of uniting the country in a way that would produce a new constitutional settlement. But let me finally just point out here that experience shows that you will not get a good constitution coming out of a process that lacks a broad-based political settlement, providing a foundation for the drafting of such constitution. Let's not run away with the idea that a new constitution could somehow resolve all of these tensions and difficulties. That's not really so. Those need to be resolved through a political process before you get into the drafting process. So in short, this is going to be very, very difficult and very much a long haul situation, but there is no alternative, I think, to simply gritting this out.
Thank you, Professor Harding, for those legal insights. Now over to Professor Takahashi for your remarks to the questions sent to you. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Thanks very much. I have a few questions, mainly sort of focusing on how can human rights be, how can, for example, people in the military, how can human rights and compliance with human rights standards be promoted within the current situation, in particular vis-a-vis people in the military? I think those are some of the key questions. So I'll just try to sort of throw some ideas out there. And I completely, I agree with what was just said about the need for a political solution. I mean, there has to be a political reckoning, if you like, and some sort of political understanding to take things forward. How long that will take is sort of an open question. I mean, it's hard to say. You know, like with the fall of the Berlin Wall, nobody saw it coming until it came. So it could be, you know, it could be a very long haul. It could be quicker than that. We would like, of course, in the human rights, you know, in all of us here, we would like to see results as soon as possible. Let's see. But one thing that I do very much want to stress as a human rights lawyer is the need for accountability. And that's something that, you know, I think is particularly stark in the example of Myanmar, because as was said by a couple of our panelists, you know, we saw what happened. The military ran amok in Rakhine, committing genocide of the Rohingya people. They weren't held to account. And so that emboldened them. I think it's a pretty fair assessment to say that must be what happened. You know, they were emboldened and figured, okay, then if we could get away with that, well, we're going to be able to get away with this. You know, I'm simplifying things, but I do think that there is that kind of psychological mechanism here. And what has to happen is we have to break that mechanism. You know, people have to be held to account for serious human rights violations. That's just what has to happen. It has to happen elsewhere, and it has to happen in Myanmar. So what I really want to stress the need for ensuring that any kind of political settlement, any kind of you know, way forward that is decided upon, to include an element that accountability is ensured, and accountability has to be ensured for past violations and for, you know, everything that's been going on. And I think that that's one of the things that countries like Japan is always very wary of. Not just with regards to Myanmar, but just in general. I received a couple of questions about Japan's sort of soft and flexible approach to human rights, and how that's an approach that can be seen not only in Japan, but in a number of other Asian countries as well. ASEAN, I think, Robin, you mentioned ASEAN, and how it's been very disappointing. You know, there's an idea that somehow let's get the sides together and we'll come to a deal, and we won't demand accountability for what's happened up till now, because that will just get in the way of progress. You know, there's a strong inclination, and you know, we've seen that all over the board internationally, to fall into that kind of trap. And I do think that's a trap, because I don't think it works. I think experience shows that without accountability for you know, really major, large-scale human rights violations, political settlements simply don't last, or they simply don't provide the kind of human rights protection that really is required for a long-term just solution. So, you know, the need for accountability, really, the importance of accountability is just one thing that I want to stress and just throw out there. So, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Takahashi. Now over to Catherine for your remarks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Ramcharan. This was such a rich response, and I'm trying to decide what to focus on and what you raised. But in any case, are we in for a protracted struggle? I'm similar to Professor Takahashi. It's very hard to say, you know, with these kinds of movements. Sometimes things can happen precipitously, and sometimes it can be protracted. But I think, you know, you can increase the chances that things don't go on in a protracted, painful, costly way. If the domestic movement is supported, and if there's international coordination in responding, the sooner the better. This is called, you know, upstream prevention. Because, and this is so important, because as you let things become more protracted, your options shrink, and then there's pressure. And someone had asked the question about the international community intervening based on R2P, responsibility to protect, this doctrine that was sort of formulated through the UN in the early 2000s, which basically articulates, existing responsibilities on the part of member states of the UN to respond to threats to peace and international security, specifically for cases where there are mass atrocities such as war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide, and that the international community must intervene where a state is committing these atrocities or where it's failing to protect the people, and so on. And that there's a continuum of response within R2P that goes from these things that we've talked about, such as freezing assets, travel bans, and sanctions, to armed intervention, which can only happen under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which requires Security Council approval, which will never happen in this Security Council. And there's also a lot of problems with armed intervention that I don't want to go into at this point, but there are many problems of mission creep. And there's, frankly, I don't think a whole lot of international appetite right now, especially in the US, for such eventualities. But we are so far away, honestly, from even considering that kind of response. We're still at the stage of trying to encourage the international community to come together and act. To put its money where its mouth is on supporting the legitimate concerns of the Myanmar public, and to slowing this rise of authoritarian repression. Some of the key things as well that I think would be really important for the domestic movement to explore. And again, for when these things are successful, it's because it was done internally. An international intervention can't make it happen. It can support and it can play a critical role at a crucial moment, but the center of gravity for a success in these situations is with the domestic movement. It's with the people. And one of the crucial things in success in these situations is internal divisions within the military. And this is something perhaps to explore is, and I haven't studied the Myanmar military as much as people, others have, and as don't know it as well as, the Myanmar public knows, but there may be opportunities and tactics to explore in trying to peel off, support from members of the military. And to see if there are, even through leaflet campaigns and in the course of demonstrations, or letting soldiers know that that the real accountability lies with leadership, and that is a factor that's important. And another factor that's really important for success is to stay nonviolent. And in taking a violent course is just dramatically can decrease the likelihood of success, because you're basically taking on an opponent who is superior to you in that respect, and so and can justify emergency and all that goes with it. And lastly, how do we do this with this divided international community? It's a challenge, but all I can say is that I think it's a matter of continuous diplomatic engagement and discussion, and really real assessment of what the interests are within the region. And on the one hand, when ASEAN is so quickly dismissed, and it is disappointing. But at the same time, the statements that came from ASEAN were rather surprisingly prompt and in the right spirit. And at the same time, this kind of challenge is a challenge for ASEAN in the sense of, deciding how to preserve ASEAN's autonomy and mandate within its own region. If ASEAN doesn't sort of act or perhaps pursue some kind of mediating role like other regional organizations have, for instance, in Africa, in similar situations, then that role will be usurped by China. And then ASEAN will have basically acquiesced to Chinese influence in a sphere where ASEAN should be really calling the, should be more engaged. And same for Japan, I would think. That if there's a fear of driving the government into the arms of China, but if you don't do anything, then you've still sort of again acquiesced to China's influence. You sort of already kind of given up. and I think that there's a growing kind of competition in that region, which is which would benefit from sort of stronger exercises of collective bargaining from ASEAN and other friendly like-minded states in the region that would be important to explore. And I think this case really is a test as to whether that kind of collective bargaining can take shape for the benefit of the whole region, and not just Myanmar and democracy in Myanmar, but preserving autonomy within ASEAN, and also signaling to China and to other authoritarian states that whether or not you're a democracy, how you treat your citizens is an important value. And if ASEAN governments don't sort of stand up for that kind of a value, then what message are they sending to their own citizens? That's a question that I put to them, and it's sort of, again, it's I think a matter of continuous sort of diplomatic engagement, and the sooner that there is diplomatic coordination, the better and the shorter this disaster can be. Thanks.
Thank you, Catherine. I will now invite remarks from Rais. Over to you, Rais.
Thank you, James. And thank you to all the panelists. In fact, a lot of the good points, most of the major points have been covered from Professor Harding, talking about the need for constitutional overhaul with political work required on the grounds. Professor Takahashi talking about nothing that can be done without accountability, and Catherine just talking about international action, coordinated action. I would like to reflect a little bit more on this international coordinated action, not particularly from the perspective of state action, but from civil societies, for example, because for the case of Rohingya, we have basically no local action capacity. We're not recognized as a body in Myanmar. We're not out in the streets, saying, here we are a Rohingya organization, and yes, we are against. No, we can't do any of that. We'll probably get slaughtered right there. So from that perspective, outside of Myanmar, starting from the refugee camps in Bangladesh to all the way here in Canada, and Rohingya civil societies in Europe and the US, we have a role, definitely a very important role to play to show solidarity with our brothers and sisters in the CDM, and of course to lobby the governments in respective countries where we are settled to exert pressure on Myanmar. Speaking of that, for where I am in Canada, I mean, the recent set of events where the Tatmadaw has just hired a Canadian Montreal-based firm to lobby for them, Ari Ben Menashe. This guy has got to be, we have got to do something to stop him under Canadian legislation itself, under Canadian sanctions or Special Economics Act under Burma, that they like to call it. It's now the time to see how much teeth there is in that, in that act that they passed. So all of that work needs to be done, and it can be done from, if not state actors, civil societies like ourselves. And finally, as an activist, I echo Kim Ayong's, her perspective. I have to be hopeful, and I really want to go back to the future, because there was a time where my parents and my grandparents lived with fellow Arkanis. They grew up with Buddhist kids. They went and played soccer together, and I'm hopeful that time's going to come one day. And we fight for that. We fight with solidarity. We fight with whatever we have. And we hope it's going to arrive someday.
Thank you very much, Rais. On that note of solidarity, may I also invite all speakers, to join us to show the sign of solidarity. And we can, if I can have you hold that out, and Asia Center will take a picture, a digital picture of that, and while that's being done, I want to read out the polls. We had a poll that touched on solidarity, and 97% of you felt civil society solidarity with civil society in Myanmar is important, and up to 68% of you answered the poll. So thank you very much for holding up this sign of solidarity for all our friends. With that, you can please place your hands down as I do the final wrap-up remarks. I'm going to share screen now just to bring your attention to a couple of other things that may be relevant for our discussion and for all friends and participants in this webinar. Asia Center is putting out a couple of briefing notes. We put the first one out, which is on the Myanmar coup and internet shutdown, that's available on our website. Feel free to access it as a resource. We will be, updating it regularly, so you have the latest information about this perspective. We also are planning for an international conference. It's looking at the impact of COVID-19. That would be the next slide. And if you are interested in participating, details, and would you like to partner for the event, details are available on our website. Last but not least, we point to our range of reports on a variety of issues related to freedom of expression, disinformation, fake news laws, as well as freedom of expression that are also available on our website. And last but not least, I invite you to follow us on LinkedIn and give us a thumbs up there. And we are sending through a link, which is a survey link. It's always good to know how this event went. So I invite you to take a couple of minutes now to fill in the Survey Monkey form link so that we are able to improve with your feedback on how we run the next webinar. With that, I thank you very much. I think if you just can hang on, the link to the Survey Monkey is coming through. If you can have a look at it, we appreciate your support. With that, thank you very much from all of us from all over the world. Good morning and good evening. Thank you and goodbye.